all of you to the second CEDRED Speaker Series talks. I think it's the second, yes. Just to note that today's session will be recorded, so please turn off your camera or remove your name or whatever if you wish to remain anonymous. So today's talk is called The Political Economy of Land, Natural Resources, and Violence in the Philippines. And I'm extremely happy to welcome my colleagues, contributors, co-researchers on a bunch of projects right now. John Edison Ubaldo, who's a research associate at the Third World Studies Center and a MA student in anthropology at the University of the Philippines, Diliman, as well as Dominique Caouette, professor of political science and Asian studies at Université du Montréal, who has a few decades of experience in this field. So we're really excited to hear your insights and what's going on in the Philippines. And I should say, Edison is joining us from the Philippines in the middle of the night. So a big thank you to you for joining us like that in the middle of the night. And without further ado, I'll leave it up to you guys to share your screen. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good. So we'll be speaking for 30 minutes. Hopefully we'll keep it within 30, so there's going to be time for exchange. And this is an ongoing research project, so all suggestions and comments are very useful because we've been doing data gathering for 3 years, and now we're going to be starting to write. So this talk is very timely for us as well in terms of our thinking process. So next slide. So this is just to underline, not so much our name because it was mentioned by Nick, but that is a joint effort. It's a long-term collaboration between the Third World Studies Center and University of Montreal. Third World Studies Center is a research unit of the University of the Philippines in Quezon City, which has a different chapter in the country. And then we've been working on multitude of projects, including research, but also video making. So each year in the past 10 years, there's been Filipino students working with UDM students producing different types of documentary on development issues. Next. So the research is in a way, what we're trying to do is to look at how peripheral region have been shaped by long-term. We use dialectical processes because what we've discovered from research previous to this project, this is a 2-3 year project that started, 4-year project started in 2016, is that in many ways, what we see in peripheral or sometimes we can marginalize region, which is far from the center, far from Manila, is there the process of inclusion, exclusion, power, counter-power, local, global, that are at play. So, and a lot of the research on land grabbing has been very contemporary. So what we thought we would do as a way to contribute to that body of literature is to look and being inspired by Brodel approach, which is a long-term historical approach. So moving away from a snapshot to look at how these processes of land grabbing or natural resources grabbing has been taking place at different times and different forms. So we're looking at, we've went back, as you will see in our data gathering, to the late 1800s and trying to move up to the present. Next, Edison. In terms of our point of departure, as I said, was an idea to discuss a dialogue with the contemporary literature on global land grab. Since 2008, there's been a massive quantity, a lot of it around the Journal of Peasant Studies produced, but also in Journal of Development Studies around the issue of land grabbing. And it took place after the financial crisis. Land was seen as a secure places to invest, and we've seen especially in Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America, a process of land grabbing. So in terms of our theoretical framework, we're trying for now to have an eclectic approach, and as we will go through our data analysis, we're going to emphasize more perspective than others, but we're inspired by the Harvey's perspective on accumulation by dispossession, when interested also of issue of political contentions, assuming that local communities or within communities, social groups are not passive, but there are multiple forms of resistance. Some are more active, some are more hidden, as Scott has underlined. And we're also inspired by the work of some international relation theoretician, such as Rosno, that talk about localization and fragmigration, meaning that there's more and more the link between global and local has been enhanced and sometimes going around nation state, but going from connecting local actors to global. So just think of a palm oil plantation which belong to a huge consortium that, and then you eating Nutella maybe for breakfast this morning. So you're connected to this processes with the palm oil plantation that might have been in Indonesia or in the Philippines. And also using an historical perspective that such as Hopkins has written on history of globalization. And finally, the idea of a symbolic power as Aguilar, a Filipino scholar, has underlined in a book called Clash of Spirit, and the idea of power and counterpower, so the dialectics of power and resistance. So that's the theoretical scene in which we're framed this project. And the project area, what we decided to do is to look at 3 areas in the Philippines, which are characterized by common feature. First, they are far from the center. So even within their own island, the Philippines has over 1,700 islands, but we're looking at islands that are not outside the centers. These 3 are central part of the Philippines, Negros and Palawan, and Mindanao is in the south. And within the island, we identify municipalities that are far from the capital cities of each of these provinces. And the idea is to see, our assumption was that by being in remote or somehow peripheral municipalities, we would be able to track down the dynamics of local powers and national power more clearly, because some of the area of the Philippines, let's say around Manila or around Luzon, they're much more immersed in national power dynamics, political dynamics, where you have local areas, you have the local landlords or local power holder that might be somehow more independent than from national dynamics or political parties, for example. So we chose 6 municipalities as our unit of analysis in these 3 regions, Negros, Mindanao, and Palawan. And I'll let Edison describe the data gathering. And as you will see, there's a reason why we have Negros, Mindanao, and Palawan. Edison?
Yeah. So for to gather data on the issue that we are looking at, first we did fieldwork interviews. So we interviewed people on the ground from these municipalities. The issue with doing just interviews would be you only get the narrative from the locals without triangulating it with a global or the common narrative of that place. Like sometimes locals would say different things about how they are perceived about by people from other places. So that's one of the things that we gathered. We had a lot of interviews, historians, local officials. We also interviewed experts like provincial historians, etc. And then we consulted with government reports, like the mining reports in the Philippines. They had this archive here in Manila, wherein you can search a company and it would show you all the investigations, the verifications, the applications that they submitted to the mining agency through the years. We were able to get reports as early as 1950s, and this showed which parties were interested in the areas, which companies tried to enter certain areas, and it also provided us some information about the state of the logging, because in some reports they would mention that these are logged off areas as evidenced by logging activities by this company. So it kind of goes into one of the issues that we are also looking at, the logging. So the mining reports provides us information on mining as well as a bit of history and logging information in our areas. Also, we consulted with online archives like the one from Hati Trust. They also have a good collection of files that are accessible to everybody. So you can read files that are from the 1970s, 1950s, etc. Like for example, we had an interview in Hinubaan, one of our areas, wherein the locals would say that the U.S. Marines visited them in 1977 because there was this sort of friendship between the municipality and the U.S. Our first impression was that it was just hearsay, since I was near that area and I didn't have that information that this municipality was somewhat connected to the US. But going into the archives, we saw that this visit in the 1970s was published in a newspaper abroad and with pictures that it was some sort of celebrating how the Filipinos in Hinubaan helped the US during the World War. So it kind of puts the municipality in the historical map of the Philippines, actually. The picture here shows one page of the mining report. So you could see the year, who wrote the report, what area is it a copper deposit investigation, etc. Then we also gathered the development plans. These are the documents produced by the Planning and Development Office of each municipality. It contains the socioeconomic profile, the historical population. Overall, it's kind of the surface data that you need from each municipality. It will provide you with the basic knowledge of what this municipality is all about, the industries present, the livelihood, gender, population, workforce, etc., and the small history of the place. They have this basic history, but we expanded on the history that they provide from these development plans. And also, we have the newspapers, of course. The thing is, we chose remote areas which are not well covered by mainstream media. For example, the national news in the Philippines would mostly publish either just big incidents from the provinces, like landslides, earthquakes in the other provinces, but most of the news would come from the national government agencies. They won't cover what is happening in local politics. There are other provincial newspapers that only covers the capital cities. So if you look at how accessible these areas are in newspapers, they rarely come out. Like they would only come out if, for example, in this one, there was a retrenchment of workers from a logging company in the area. So it came out in the provincial newspaper, but on every day, they don't really have that coverage for media. So newspapers don't have a complete information of what has happened in these areas historically. And this is one of the most important document that we gathered, the land titles and the tax maps. So in land titles, you would see who owned the land at certain points of time. And then one of the pages would show you the transactions, like this was from this was taken from this number lot owned by this company or this person. So you get some sort of a history of the land, the transactions that it went through, when it was acquired, who acquired it, where he lives. So it kind of gave us the basic information on tracking how land holdings evolved in the area. And we have the tax maps, which were taken from the local government. So land titles provided us who owned at what point in time. But these land titles is not the whole land title of the whole municipality. We only gathered accessible land titles from the Agrarian Reform Office in the local municipality. This Agrarian Reform Office, they are the ones in charge of redistributing the lands in the Philippines. It's a program by the Philippine government, which has been running for decades now. They redistribute big chunks of land to farmers, and when they retitle lands, they get this information, and they released to us when we went on the field. And for the tax maps, these are the current land holdings. So who owns currently? So what we did was we took out the land titles, we checked the history, and then we checked the current ones and see who owned before and who owns it now. Like for example, you can see the lot number here, the address, etc., the barangay. You would see if one owner retained from the 1950s up until 2010, 2017. So it shows you the percentage. Actually, we were able to come up with a percentage of owners like in the 1950s, 60% of the owners in the 1950s were original owners from the land, from those that were redistributed. The issue with our limited resources on land titles is it's not a complete land title set of the whole municipality, but it gives us an idea of who were the big landowners, because only the big lands before were redistributed. Those smaller lands owned by people were not redistributed. They maintained control. So that is one of the issues. It's not complete, but it gives you a big snippet of how landholding in each municipality. And then we also gathered other archival documents. It's since our approach is historical, we went to different archives in the municipalities if they have in different offices. We looked for old people or local historians if they have. We gave us documents. In Negros, for example, they had this Negros Occidental Historical Commission, and they were able to give us documents as early as 1900s. It's useful to focus your data gathering on the locality rather than hoping to get something old from the national agencies like the National Archives, for example. Since we are studying remote areas, it would be hard to get specific data of these areas from the national government since they're more macro than specific. So yeah, so how did we make sense of the data that we gathered? So first, the realizations. We had an assumption when we went on the field, but after gathering all these data, we realized that it will take a lot of work to prove our hypothesis, our assumptions early on, and we found a lot of interesting issues, and we realized that it would be a challenge on how we will analyze the data that we got. Since it was a lot, we were looking at 7 municipalities and looking on different issues. So I'll show you first the data organization part. It's important. We feel that it's important that each researcher should be able to organize his or her files properly. So this is our data gathering file for the project. We have these 3 areas: the Mindanao, Negros, and Palawan, and then we have other folders. So we always make it organized so that we can just come back to it if ever we want. So yeah, you can see the yes.
Edison, sorry, because you're not sharing the screen. We only see the PowerPoint. We don't see the Excel file. I think the Google Drive.
I'll share I'll share the screen, the other screen now. Okay, here. Yeah. Oops, wrong screen. Sorry. This one. Yeah. These are the folders. For example, this is the one in Negros, and when you organize your files into folders, it also takes some sort of a strategy. Like for example, first I started with dates on files that I feel needed to be dated, and then I went on alphabetizing, like civil cases, agriculture reports, forest reports, interviews, the plans from each municipal local agency. We also, outside of doing it in folders, we kind of indexed it into different types, like the maps. So if we just want to see maps, we have the maps, all the legal documents that we have, the data from the Mines and Geosciences Bureau of the Philippines, a compilation of newspapers, since we can share this information to other people as well. And when we developed the website, we just used our index on newspapers to post everything related to the project. And then we have this tax map control roll. That's the tax map that I was talking about early on. I started this on a virtual notebook for field work interaction. So it's kind of a day-to-day schedule. And then I put a link on the transcription of the interviews. So I could sort of make a timeline how I went during the field work. So that's the data organization. And then I'll show you the data indexing that we did. this one. This is the master list of the data initially that we had. So I categorized it according to area, etc., with links to the Google folder. So this will help you look at what you currently have and what you need to look for. So this was our initial data gathered for the 3 areas, and then when we accessed each document, you would find sorts of excerpts or useful informations that covers the issues that we want to look at. We put it in this incident timeline. I decided to use Excel file because it's easily accessible, and you can do some kind of creative filtering mechanisms. Like at first, we only had this column C, column D, and column E. But I realized that each information we put in is under certain theme that we're looking at. For example, logging, plantations, you have mining, and then later on tourism. So it's also useful to categorize it. And then later on, after reading much of the data, we realized that we should further categorize it according to which sectors or stakeholders locally are involved in different themes that we're looking at. For example, this Flyder family was the owner of a plantation. And then there's this one family who was a big plantation owner, but they also ventured into mining and tourism later on. So it kind of helps you if you want to look at just the family, we can filter it out to show information about the family. And then we also, this is the tax map that I was discussing earlier. It's numbered, it's per barangay. It shows you the area of the lot that these people are owning, and they go into the thousands actually. So it gives us an idea of who owns the land currently, and we compare it with the land titles. You see that some of the land holdings did not change after 4 decades, and mostly it's still being owned by political families. Later on, we decided to share what we gathered. So we had this website, the Land and Resource Use in the Philippines website. We put the Media Watch here, wherein people can access the news reports on mining, logging, etc., on the different areas that we are studying. And then when they look at separate areas, they could get the history, pictures of the mining site, and or also pictures of our research fieldwork. So far, that's how we gathered the data that we currently have. We now move on to the key findings of our research. So after gathering the data, what did we learn? First, the areas that we are studying all started as frontier lands, and it is useful to understand that they are frontier lands at different points of time, because it gives you the context of why the dynamics on land grabbing is different in these areas. For example, in Negros, land settlement started in the southern Negros, 1900s, for southern Mindanao, 1930s, and 1940s for Palawan. This is connected to agrarian reform. So in Negros, since the land settlement started earlier, the political families were on firm hold of the land holdings. So when the agrarian reform entered, most of them did not lose their lands. They still maintained control of their land. In Mindanao, only a little bit of the political families retained their lands because they were not as established as those in Negros. And then in Palawan, there's little to no opposition to the agrarian reform because they were established around the 1950s. And so the lands were just, most of the lands were not developed and they were idle lands. So they were given away right away. In logging, we had logging entered in these areas at different points of time. In Negros, it started the 1920s, and then in Mindanao, 1950s. It's useful to know that logging started earlier in Negros. So plantations entered way earlier, since the reason why the southern Negros was not really accessible even to the capital city is because there were forests covering the area. So they go by boat to enter the municipality from the other municipalities. There's no road. So when the logging concession entered, they opened the roads. It made the area accessible. In southern Mindanao, the logging occurred in the 1950s, and then that's when the big plantation entered after. Since the land was cleared, the plantation can now plant pineapples in the land. In southern Palawan, they say that there's no really big logging concession that stayed for a long time, but a lot of people logged the mountains because of they want to build houses. So it's not really it's a different issue in southern Palau. It's more on local policies versus culture of ethnic people who are saying that they own the forest for themselves. And on plantations, you have different types of plantations in the three areas. In Negros, you have hacienda type. So there's an owner of a big chunk of land, and they hire workers to plant sugarcane mostly. But in Hinubaan, they were planting coconut. In Mindanao, they implemented this contract growing scheme. So the company would talk to landowners that they will rent this piece of land for 10 years with this amount. In southern Palawan, they did a different one. They would hire the people to plant, but the people would follow the protocols of the company. So it's like the company will just buy from the people, from the locals. So it's a different kind of scheme, but in all these things, the company or the owner has the control over what is the land being used to. And then we go to mining. So in terms of mining, it really entered these areas differently. So in Negros, it came after the Japanese occupation. It's because the Japanese people, they investigated the area in southern Negros since there were lots of mineral deposits. And then after the Japanese, new Filipino businessmen decided to explore the area. And since there was only a logging concession present in the area, southern Negros was accessible right away. In southern Mindanao, since it's not really that accessible, they didn't have mining companies early on. They only had small scale mining in the 1980s up until the present. And then in southern Palawan, when they started with the land settlements in the 1950s, it also the entrance of mining, because from what we realized on these three areas, in Negros, the migration of people to the south was natural. In southern Mindanao, it was planned by the National Agency of the Philippines. They took people from Luzon and Visayas. They shipped them out to Mindanao to till the land. But in southern Palawan, the lands were owned by the indigenous people. And to gain access to the resources, they tried to implement land settlement programs similar to that in Mindanao. So when they put up the land settlement program in central Palawan, the southern Palawan opened up, and thus mining companies entered, and then later on the plantations entered as well. So in agrarian reform, as I mentioned earlier, the context of when land settlements started in these areas affected how agrarian reform was implemented in these different areas. In tourism, since tourism is kind of a new thing, it's still developing in the Philippines. The tourism land grab is still, we kind of lack data to analyze yet, since they just have basic tourism plans, but no there's really nothing very specific to say that land grabs happen because of tourism yet. So yeah, that's what we have, and I give the floor to Dom.
So what we are at now is what we see is we in the three regions seems to be a pattern, and the pattern has been logging, mining, agriculture, tourism, in the sense that these frontier land were land that people moved because they were free. So it was like a bit like what we have as when we say the Far West, like they were in many ways, it was a Far West capitalism because there were few rules and people could grab as much as they want. The picture we have on the cover for this talk is Flyder, the old man who acquired up to 2,000 hectare of land, acre, and the town was his town because he printed his own money. So his employees were paid with his own money, that he printed his own money, and they had to go and buy in the general store, which he owns as well. So people that were, it was a, the entire community was revolved around his family. So it was very fascinating because when we talk, they say, yeah, we had money, but and we could exchange it for pesos to go buy outside, but you would get cheated at the exchange rate. So more or less they control people. So in the three region, Negros, Palawan, and Mindanao, we see a pattern of frontier land, and frontier land are first grab for logging, in some cases for mining purposes, in some cases for agriculture. So we see now more and more the type of agriculture planted are palm oil, coconut, and there's been one way through mining and through agriculture. You see global flows of capitalism going into this area because these mining were owned by, in many cases, Canadian mining, for example. In other cases, what is being planted is being shipped outside. These are new crops for export. Tourism is also interesting because it's also global flow of capitalism based on this emerging middle class people, democratization of tourism. So you see in Negros now people who were like landlord who had been forced to distribute some of their land have moved into tourism. And also in Negros especially, you see a lot of foreigners marrying a local woman so that they can own the land because you're not entitled as foreign to own land. So you see again another form of encroaching of capitalist flow in these remote areas. So that's a bit where we're at in terms of analyzing. We've seen this pattern, the three region in different times. The uh, key finding, the next slide, please, is that what we see first is what I just described, the cycle of extraction and accumulation that it seems to be evolving in the three places at different time with different actors, but a very similar pattern. The second is what we've discovered is all of these different periods were wrapped in certain narrative. The narrative of settlement, settling areas, making it accessible for progress, modernity, making it more productive. And then you have the discourse on developing the area, economic development. And now more lately, we start to see more and more the discourse around environmental protection, as in Palawan, for example, and ecology has become some of the issues. So you see some forms of green grabbing, which is supposed to be for environmental purposes. So what our research are pointing out at the moment is the various form of how powers is expressed in different forms. So you have formal power, which is the institution, but at the in remote area, informal power is as important as the formal forms of power. So local leaders, for example, Flyder, which in Negros was, when we did the interview, people told us he had a submarine. So we were saying, how come he had a submarine? He would use a submarine to go from island to island. And then we discovered that was an hydroplane, but for people, it looks like a submarine. So there's all these types of legend where power is embodied in symbolic power and making people more than what they just are. Like the established family have power, which is formal power, but as well as different form of symbolic power. This other element that we see is the issue of land as being a key issue, a key axis of confrontation and political contention between agrarian reform struggling for land. In some cases, it has gone in Negros, for example, and parts of Mindanao, it's been armed rebellion by those who are dispossessed or those who are claiming access to land. And it has forced, in some cases, the putting in place and the implementation of land reform. But the contradictory characteristic of land reform is that many people who were given title for example, in central Mindanao, in the South Cotabato, we see Dole Plantation having been the first one to offer its land for land reform. So you have the largest pineapple plantation in the area, offering its land for land reform ahead of everyone else because they redistributed titles to their workers, but at the same time, they told the worker, we're going to give you a contract growing arrangement where you continue working for us. So you're both the owner of the land, we pay rent, but we also employs you. And most people have agreed. And so they are self-exploiting themselves in a certain way because they own the land, which is on paper is their land, but they're working still for Dole, the company. Mining, same story. Mining is very much similar to, I think, what some areas of Canada. These are large mining company, mining town that were rich and doing well while the company was there. But once they left, there's no accountability mechanism that they have to rehabilitate the area. So you see in Negros and you see in other area, mining site that have been abandoned with no responsibility. And the claim is that the ownership has shifted from one to the other. So if you purchase a mine from someone else, you say, I'm not responsible for damages that were done before. And so I talk about rebellion and reforms. The last point also is the tension between private versus collective rights, because indigenous communities in the area and many of the area that were logged and many of the area where mining company came were indigenous land. And now with the new Indigenous People Rights Act, they are able to claim for collective ancestral domain claims. So you see tension between private land or private title for the settlers that came from other provinces versus collective right that has been newly put into a national law that allows indigenous communities to claim access to these rights. So that's more or less the type of finding we're wrestling with. I just put some note that what we've done so far, we're starting to publish result of the research. There's going to be an issue of a journal published by the Thorough Study Center that looks at some of the issues that we're facing with. The challenges is the data analysis because it's a massive quantity of data, like the land title or the tax map control map. In one barangay, you would think it's a small unit, it's the smallest unit in the Philippines. You have sometimes 4,000 to 5,000 to 6,000 title to process. So we have people have been processing, and Edison is doing an incredible job trying to match the line title with the tax control map. So this is a big issue. And the last one is we are planning next year to go to the Library of Congress because one of the challenges in the Philippines is preserving archives is not their priority, and there's many other priorities for government. So a lot of the archives are in poor quality, or whenever you ask people, they're very willing to talk. It's the beauty of doing fieldwork in the Philippines. People are quite open to talk, official and non-official, and willing to talk. But as soon as you ask for archives, there's a big smile on their face and they say, oh, maybe, but you know, the cockroach, the typhoon, the humidity, you cannot get it. Or in certain cases, it took us 3 years to get access to data because we kept coming every year with a nice smile. We're doing a research, it's with UP. Can we see the land title? And then they would be very, very reluctant because who owns the land is a lot of power associated to land title. And it's only this year, last year, that we were able, after 3 years of coming every time and say, come back tomorrow or next week, I have to check with my boss, that we're able to access these land titles. So we've been going through file cabinets of stuff and have a lot of data now to wrestle with, but some of it will have to be complemented by what we hope will be a fruitful visit in the Library of Congress, which has a lot of data and newspaper of the area. So maraming salamat. Questions, suggestions, any comments, they're all very much welcome because we're on the stage to start writing the, hopefully a monograph, but now we're going by chapter on the research.
So we have about 20 minutes. And if anyone would like to ask a question, turn on your camera if you want to. It'd be nice to see you, and your microphone as well.
Edison, can you put me as co-host, because I have a map of the Philippines that I'd like to show.
I don't know how to put somebody as co-host.
I think Ryan might have to do it. Edison, if you go down to the bottom, you'll see the green share option, and then you can allow other participants to share their screen. Maybe.
You're a host already, Dominique.
Okay, so
okay.
Okay, I thought that might be useful to give an idea of, because we didn't put a map, we forgot, but this is the National Capital Region. This is Central Luzon. This is a highly density population. The research we're doing is in Negros, is right here at the bottom. So the capital is here, but we're right here between the two provinces. It's quite isolated. It's about almost more 10 hours almost to get there by bus. The second area is Mindanao. Mindanao, we're in this southern part of Mindanao. And this also was, interestingly, the capital of the area is General Santos, not the main city, which is the name of the settler that came in and settled the area, but then he went to Palawan after. So the third area is Palawan. This is in the South Chinese Sea or West Philippine Sea. And we're doing research right at the tip of the island. So these are, and the capital is here. So these are the three regions to give you an idea of what it is. You see only the main island, but you see we found region far from the center.
I think there was one question, sir, from the chat.
Yeah. Oops, I don't see it.
It was a long comment, yes. Do you want me to ask you? So the question comes from Gideon. He says, what were the criteria and basis in choosing the fieldwork sites in the Philippines, which you've kind of just addressed? And then second question, what concrete lessons would the Philippine experience in violence related to the use of land and natural resources teach the Canadian study of political economy?
Edison, you want to go first?
Sorry, sir. You can go ahead, sir. I'm trying to write the document, sir.
Okay, so the criteria, we wanted to have three regions that has not been covered by local historians. So a lot of the studies have been done in other island, other region. That was the first one. Two, we wanted to have region where we could have the three characteristics. We wanted to have places where you had logging, you had plantation, and mining, and some form of tourism. We thought this is nice because it makes it comparable. And three, these are region where you have different range of violence. In what we did not mention in Negros, there was a very important insurgency. The New People's Army was very active, especially in the region we were in, the southern Negros, that used to be the Chicks area. The five municipalities were seen as the basis for the insurgency. And in 88, 89, there was a massive operation similar to what they tried to do in Vietnam, no man's land, where they forced people out of their area and even use a vigilante group to go. If you're found to be in the area where you were supposed to have been evacuated, they would burn your farm and house, and in some cases execute you. So we have seen a lot of violence. In Mindanao, it's even more complex. I mean, especially if you're from Jensen, you have different insurgency groups. So you have the Islamic group, you have the NPA, which is active too, and you have some form of resistance from, sometimes armed resistance from indigenous community. And in Palawan, the violence is not as direct, is more other forms of violence. And like, for example, by making Palawan a environmentally sustainable island, you have that form of green grabbing where people have been pushed out of their territory, and you create national parks. So they create park where indigenous, the Tagbanoa, for example, in the Palawan, they were this is part of the ancestral domain, but they've been pushed out of their own ancestral domain, and the monitoring of these these conservation area are being done by people from other islands, people of Tagalog and people from the Visaya coming in and acting as a forest guard, forest ranger for this area where in fact these are indigenous communities. So there's different ranges of violence or different forms of violence. And we're trying to match as well as, can we, if you do a graph, can we match when you have a peak of resistance, of armed resistance, and then are reforms coming after? And in Negros, we see it. In Mindanao, it's quite interesting because it's quite difficult. What we see in Mindanao is a decrease in violence once, for example, land has been redistributed. And as I said, although they are self-exploiting themselves, they do have a higher income than they had before. But mining projects are those who create violence or tension, because you have, in some cases, and maybe Edison can talk about it, you have mayors and governors who are opposed to mining companies who are endorsed by national power holder. So you have local, provincial versus national policymaker, which makes it very interesting, because you have resistance, which is not made only by local communities, but you have governor are opposing mining, but by doing so, they oppose the national administration, and they have to be firm in standing against what might be the consequence of getting less transfer from the central government. So these are type of issues. I don't know, Edison, if you want to add anything.
I think it's just important to note that you shouldn't focus on one issue if you're looking at land grabbing, for example, since we've seen that the family of the Flyder and the Montillas, they were involved not just in logging, they were involved in mining, they were involved also in tourism development. So it's always good to have a holistic view and to look the full picture, not just on one certain issue.
Sylvia asked a question about the sites where you have Christian and Muslim population and indigenous. Actually, most, 1, 2, 3, maybe less in Negros, but in Palawan and in Mindanao, you have a mix of these three population living together, and it's much more mixed. You know, scholar and the media tend to essentialize identity when it comes to Muslim and Christian and indigenous. What we found on the ground is much more mixed, and these identities are mobilized sometimes by political actor for specific goals, but in many ways they have people who have been living days to days beside each other, and it hasn't been the key issue of contention as much as who owns the land and who controls the land, and these can be mobilized at certain times. But in all places, and Negros may be less because the indigenous community is not as important and Muslim community is less. But in the three areas, you have some this mix, which is we've talked with it's the link with the question on Canada. We've talked with the colleagues from Guelph, which are working in Canada, and it's in the area in the Philippines. It's like it's really hard to say this is indigenous communities per se because it's much more mixed. The indigenous community that we have seen in Canada would be in more remote area, and those are mostly affected by mining. In another area in Negros, the indigenous community was able to obtain like 5,000 hectares, and now they're the one a bit maybe what's happening in Canada. They're negotiating with investor on how the resource can be used, and it's a decision-making process are made by the Council of Elders and parts of the community.
There is another question from Verena. Verena, you can feel free to ask it, or we can read it as well.
Yeah,
I guess. Yeah. Do you have that, Dominique?
Yeah. Do you want to go for it, Edison? On the mapping.
In terms of the mapping of the ownership, we can have a kind of mapping from redistributed lands of those that are collected individually, but we had access to some lands. It's like 1,000 hectares divided into 14 people. So those are the collective land owned by different people. So we can map a little bit, but not the full map of the whole municipality, because we were only able to access those lands that were redistributed. So around, I think the total we have for one municipality is around 3 to 5,000 hectares out of their total area of maybe 10 to 15, 30,000 hectares. So we kind of just taken a small percentage. We are basing only those redistributed lands that were accessible via the Agrarian Reform Office. So it's we know that it's not the full picture, but given that these are the lands owned by more powerful families, they owned big before, so we are studying these parts.
Sorry, I was playing with the map just because the question was asked by Gideon on Lanao. This is an interesting area, but the problem is the and I guess Guelph is the same thing. These areas which are hotly contested, and we're prohibited to go do research, especially to bring students to do research in Lanao del Sur because of the intense conflict around surrounding Marawi and the confrontation. So these, all of Mindanao, almost all of Mindanao, except certain area are, if you look at Kenyan Travel Advisory, so which student needs to check before to be able to access. These are area that you're not supposed to be going. Palawan, it's easier in a way because it's safer, and Negros too. So the big issue is Mindanao. So that's why we took General Santos, because it was considered as an area that is relatively safe to do research. But Lanao for sure, Lanao del Sur and Del Norte would be great cases. And the issue is to be able to conduct research or to bring, to do it with graduate students.
So we have another one here from Sherry. Did you want me to read it?
Sorry. No, I can read it. I just wrote it in case I have to leave. I have another meeting starting at 1. It was a great presentation. You just really exemplify the rich history and importance of land title, and looking at those historical relationships and change over time for it, how it influences the current context. I'm just amazed by the amount of data you've collected. So I look forward to seeing how you're managing that. I have so many questions around that itself. But the one question that came to mind is, here in Canada, at least we're hearing, or in some areas, hearing that the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples and other instruments may be having an effect. And I'm wondering, an effect of changing that power balance and the recognition of Indigenous rights to land and cultural, that are often really interconnected. I was just wondering if you're seeing any influence of any international, or can you sort of characterize what that shift is in the one chart you presented? And it may or may not be emerging, but I just wondered, because here in Canada we see it's emerging more as a primary driver for change.
Yes, you want to go, and I'll go after.
I think in terms of indigenous rights, it's good and bad. For example, it's good because we have the IPRA law here in the Philippines. You have the free and prior informed consent that should disallow any corporate interest in the area. But also, as mentioned, in certain areas, it has become one of the factors. That's why land is exploited, since indigenous people, they own a lot of land. They would negotiate with land grabbers. So in a way, it's both good and bad for indigenous people.
It's very interesting, the UN instrument, because IPRA is used as an example of successful recognition of indigenous people's right, and it was passed in '97 in the Philippines. What we've seen is oftentimes those laws are used, but they can be they can be very long to get results. So what you see is, if you have an external actor like an NGO or indigenous people group that helps move the processes, there are people like anthropologists and then priests that have organized indigenous communities to move paper along the bureaucracy, but it costs a lot of money. So because only for our research we discovered the layers of bureaucracy, and no one wants to move until someone else moves on top of it. And it has created a lot of, there's opportunities and tools are leveraged. At the same time, it's very difficult. It takes a long time to implement. the one we've seen in the cases in Negros, that has been a long process in coming. And it turns out that the dots were aligned because he had a proactive indigenous peoples officer in Bacolod, in the provincial capital, that could push in. In fact, it was the brother of someone who was pushing it in the area. So yeah, the clear connection, and they were able to make some gains quickly. What we see it also, it's the discourse on corporate social responsibility, which has been used by big corporations. So the mining, Rio Tinto, Rio Tuba, sorry, Rio Tinto is second, but Rio Tuba in southern Palawan, they created a council of elders within the mining company. So they have 16 leaders that are part of the council of elders that are included in the process and officially recognized by the mining companies. But they do, now they're encroaching in more communities. And what we discovered, we thought, oh, nice, all indigenous communities are part of this. And we discovered there are seven or eight barangay, which have different indigenous communities that are not part of it, and they are excluded. And they're getting the raw deal because this is where the mining is now expanding. So yes, the international instruments are present, but they are used. They can be manipulated in both ways for gains, but as well as for consolidating some form of powers. And this is why the CSR, the corporate social responsibility discourse, is quite fascinating how it's framed sometimes.
Thank you. That's excellent. Thank you. Really insightful.
But it's just starting that we want your insight because we're now in the process of starting to write about all the data.
Sir, Gideon messaged that he is from Mindanao State University. Actually, we met with faculty of Mindanao State University, Ompong Rodil, the sort of local historian in northeastern Mindanao. But it's just, it would be a challenge for Canadians to go to different areas in Mindanao, given the travel advisories. So that's the main issue. It's just that normally Dominique is just game going anywhere, even if the travel advisory is not that favorable.
But the Hong Kong, for example, these are the treasure that we find. Hong Kong Rodil is like a Wikipedia of the history. This is the most amazing. It must be in the late 70s, but he has a terrific memory, and he is an archive. It's a walking archive. So we met with him, a long interview. We share data, we exchange. But these are the people that we're looking for because the physical archives are difficult to track down. So part of what we've been doing with Hong Kong is try to set up this website so that he can also use it for his own research. But I mean, the whole of Mindanao would be interesting to do research. But when we met with him, it was just before, it was 2015, before the Marawi siege, and already it was starting to become difficult to be there. There was checkpoint, and then so a part of it is for logistical reason, but we've been in touch with the Mindanao State University. The question is, we cannot cover everything, and also part of a research project is to bring, I guess, like ME student or PhD student from Canada to go to this area. We cannot do some area. We won't be able to do it because they won't get funding from the to do their field work. So that limits our area of coverage in many ways.
It is 1 o'clock. And we did say that we would end there. Are there any other kind of burning questions before we say bye? Nothing. So, well then, I would like to thank our guest speakers. That was fantastic. Very engaging. Thank you to everyone who asked questions and engaged with the material. Really good stuff. The next CEDRED Speaker Series event is on October 21st at noon with Michelle Porter. Michelle's presentation is entitled Approaching Fire, Arts-Based Research and Other Crooked Methodologies. So another exciting presentation, cutting edge stuff like Edison and Dominique presented today. And I think you can learn more on their website too. You know, you guys have you guys have a website, don't you? Maybe you could put it in the chat if people want to learn more. We are doing a bit of work at the University of Guelph, but that work has been very much stunted and halted because of COVID. So we haven't advanced our work on our end very much. But Angela is doing a lot of the work at the U of G. But yeah, it'd be great. I can see Edison posted the website, so the Red TAC website. So if anyone wants to learn more, I think that would be a great spot. Dominique?
Yeah, and I have a last pitch. We were supposed to do it this summer, this spring, but because of COVID, it was postponed. But next year, we would have a summer school on research methodologies in Asia, in Southeast Asia. So anyone from Guelph is much welcome. Angela was supposed to come. So exploring research methodology in difficult area and in multiple areas such as Southeast Asia. So anyone interested, if we're able to reopen UP and TWSC, there will be a summer school that would be around May next year.
Thank you very much. That was fantastic. A clap, a virtual clap. All right, everyone.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Ingat.